de menor crecimiento económico, un mundo de política monetaria restrictiva en los países ricos, lo cual esa combinación de bajo crecimiento y de altas tasas de interés dan lugar a mercados de deuda mucho más tensos y tirantes de los que conocíamos antes, ¿no? Y para países del sur global que necesitan ese financiamiento para encarar los objetivos de desarrollo, se abre un nuevo panorama, bastante más negativo del que conocíamos antes. Los mercados de deuda se conectan con otros objetivos, por supuesto, que tiene la política fiscal o la política pública, que aparecen en tensión. Los mercados de deuda, al tensarse, demandan reducción del déficit fiscal, demandan baja del gasto público, aumento en los impuestos. Y en ese terreno entran en tensión el objetivo de la estabilidad de corto plazo con los objetivos del desarrollo sostenible y de la inclusión, ¿no? Entonces aparecen esas tensiones que conocemos bien en América Latina y en otros países del mundo emergente, de tener que mostrar consolidación fiscal de corto plazo a costa de renunciar o posponer objetivos de desarrollo. Y para bajar un poco más nos referimos a objetivos que pueden ser de enverdecer a la economía o también objetivos de generar más inclusión, o que ese mismo proceso de consolidación fiscal no genere un aumento en la desigualdad o brechas aún más grandes, por ejemplo, en términos de género. Entonces, estuvimos trabajando estos temas y un poco lo que queremos discutir en este evento tiene que ver con, primero, pensar un marco conceptual para conectar las discusiones que hay sobre deuda pública y sistema financiero internacional, con las discusiones que hay sobre ambiente y financiamiento verde, con las discusiones que hay sobre inclusión y desigualdad en nuestros países. No existe todavía un marco conceptual que permita integrar o que genere consenso y permite integrar estas discusiones en una forma escalable, sencilla para todos los países. Es un trabajo que todavía tenemos que realizar. El segundo tema a explorar, que va a salir también de la discusión de hoy, tiene que ver con los contextos nacionales. Las dinámicas de deuda y las dinámicas de políticas verdes y de inclusión son intensivas en detalles que difieren a lo largo de los países, ¿no? Es difícil pensar un único blueprint que pueda servir para todos los países en todo momento. Y tenemos que entender un poco más cuáles son los detalles que importan a los distintos países. Entonces, nos vamos a meter a discutir estudios de caso para poder encontrar esas cuestiones específicas de los países que importan a los debates sobre deuda y desarrollo. Y el tercer punto, que vamos a tratar más sobre el final de nuestro webinar, tiene que ver con el rol de las instituciones financieras internacionales, de los organismos bilaterales y multilaterales de crédito en estas discusiones que vamos a tener. Entonces, vamos a discutir sobre marcos conceptuales, vamos a discutir sobre contextos nacionales y diferencias en los países y entre las regiones, y vamos a discutir más sobre el final sobre el rol de la comunidad financiera internacional en este esquema. Buena parte de lo que discutamos aquí, como decía al principio, sale de resultados del proyecto que venimos realizando con el apoyo de IDRC, con las discusiones que tuvimos con Arian y también con Walter de IDRC, que después también van a aparecer comentando nuestras presentaciones. Son proyectos de multipaís, multiregión, y donde tratamos todo el tiempo de que lo que se generaba de esos estudios de caso dialogue, alimente las discusiones globales que existen hoy en día sobre deuda y ambiente en los organismos multilaterales y bilaterales de crédito. Entonces van a escuchar sobre marco conceptual, van a escuchar sobre casos, van a escuchar sobre el sistema financiero internacional. Y siempre vamos a buscar las conexiones entre deuda, ambiente e inclusión. Dicho esto, vamos a empezar con primeras reflexiones sobre uno de los ejes que estuvimos trabajando, que incorporan perspectivas de inclusión y género a las discusiones de deuda y de política fiscal que tuvimos en el proyecto. Así que para eso incorporo acá la discusión a Cecilia Alemani, que es directora regional adjunta de UN Women para América Latina. Ceci, si puedes empezar con unas reflexiones iniciales para un poco marcar el campo de la discusión que vamos a tener luego.
Muchas gracias, Ramiro. Bueno, muchas gracias a todos y todas por acompañarnos y realmente, bueno, lo primero creo que es unas felicitaciones a todos los equipos que estuvieron involucrados, tanto desde Red Sur, en la coordinación regional que vamos a escuchar con el liderazgo de Fernando Lorenzo, Luis Miguel Galindo y tuyo propio, Ramiro Abreu, y los equipos. Hoy vamos a escuchar en profundidad el trabajo de Fundación ARU en Bolivia, de CADEP en Paraguay, miembros de Red Sur, y de todo el trabajo en Honduras. Y también todos los estudios de caso que se desarrollaron en África, en particular, creo que es muy importante resaltar el esfuerzo que hicieron Ma Ekeruche y todo el equipo en Nigeria del Center for Study of the Economics of Africa en incorporar la perspectiva de género en todo el debate de sostenibilidad de la deuda. Creo que la primera reflexión es que este ejercicio de investigación en los dos continentes se inicia todavía en la pandemia, pensando en la recuperación de la pandemia y cómo traer un enfoque de sostenibilidad de la deuda que colocabas, Ramiro. Hoy esto se hace todavía más importante en la medida que ese horizonte de largo plazo del 2030 de los Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible o del 2050 del Acuerdo de París están cada vez más cercanos y toda la evidencia dice que estamos muy lejos de lograr esas metas, ¿no? Entonces todos los países del mundo están discutiendo cuáles son las estrategias para acelerar el avance, por un lado, de los ODS en su conjunto y de los acuerdos de París. Estas investigaciones, tanto en América Latina como en África, nos ponen en evidencia estos trade-offs, como bien decía Ramiro, pero los verdaderos desafíos y oportunidades para instrumentos innovadores del financiamiento del cambio climático y la transformación productiva para una gestión sostenible, no solo de la deuda, sino también de los recursos naturales con una perspectiva de igualdad. Y creo que esto es lo más novedoso, ¿no? Tenemos distintos enfoques, una mirada realmente transformadora que Fernando Lorenzo y Luis Miguel Galindo nos van a resumir en este primer panel que sigue a continuación, que se va a enfocar en América Latina, pero también creo que por primera vez un ejercicio de escenarios prospectivos que combinan el eje de sostenibilidad de la deuda, el cambio climático y el financiamiento del cambio climático, con un ejercicio de temporalizar de forma realista cómo se financia y cómo se generan ingresos en ese sentido, y escenarios hacia sistemas nacionales de cuidados, que en este sentido creo que es importante resaltar, existe cada vez más evidencia de que una de las maneras de reducir las desigualdades, no solo de género, sino también de ingresos, tiene que ver con este nuevo pilar, digamos, de la protección social que son los sistemas de cuidados. Y tenemos, digamos, estas simulaciones y estos escenarios hechos claramente para todos los estudios de caso de América Latina y con una reflexión regional, que es la primera vez que encontramos algo así, además de una serie de instrumentos muy aplicados para el diseño de estas políticas, que creo que es buena parte lo que este proyecto pone, es realmente cómo seguir después haciendo que estos compromisos se transformen en realmente ejercicios de política pública transformadores. Y quiero señalar también todo el ejercicio, que no es fácil, evidentemente, conectar estas dimensiones, porque venimos de disciplinas en compartimientos estancos, ¿no? Donde quienes estudian el cambio climático no siempre están mirando la fiscalidad, no están mirando la deuda, ni el cambio productivo, y mucho menos la desigualdad de género o cómo tener sistemas nacionales de cuidados pueden transformar no solo el mundo del trabajo, sino también el sector productivo y reproductivo. Creo que en este sentido, la integralidad de todas estas investigaciones que se traducen en muchos working papers que hoy se van a estar presentando en resumen, es realmente innovadora y además es birregional y en este sentido creo que es importante también que tengamos a FDL, al Financing for Development Lab, con Martín al final para hacer esta reflexión desde a nivel global. Creo que el trabajo efectivamente nos va a hacer un resumen de todos los estudios que hicieron en el caso de Nigeria, pero quiero resaltar especialmente la forma en que pudieron analizar y traer, y en este sentido también es muy innovador, los efectos en la desigualdad de género con esta mirada de una emergencia global de salud, ¿no? Como fue la pandemia, ¿qué aprendemos de ahí? Y cuál es la evidencia empírica que ellos nos traen desde Nigeria. Creo que esto se combina muy bien con todo el esfuerzo de los escenarios de cuidados que se hizo en todos los estudios de caso de América Latina, y esto realmente es innovador para el resto del sur global, y espero que nos puedan ilustrar hoy con esta evidencia empírica que por supuesto estamos todos deseando escuchar, y sobre todo pensar, bueno, cómo hacemos que esto realmente ayude a esta respuesta post-pandémica que era el objetivo detrás. Hay que decir que en el camino la sociedad a nivel internacional tomó esto como prioridades, ¿no? Tanto a nivel internacional como acelerar el logro de los objetivos, como decíamos recién, hoy ha sido la prioridad en la Asamblea General de Naciones Unidas los últimos días. Todos los jefes de Estado han estado discutiendo cómo aceleran el logro de los ODS y los acuerdos de París, pero además, desde el punto de vista de América Latina, creo que es importante decir que entre las prioridades que ahora, y sé que vas a volver sobre esto, Ramiro, más adelante también, que coloca el gobierno de Brasil, el gobierno Lula, tanto para su presidencia del G20 como para la COP30, que van a ser todas en los próximos 2 años en la región. Entre las 3 prioridades del G20 está Deuda, con lo cual todo el esfuerzo que este equipo en los 2 continentes viene haciendo tiene ahora un espacio de incidencia claro en el próximo G20 en Brasil, y de cara a la COP30, donde se van a evaluar en ese momento también cómo se ha implementado todo lo que es los planes de cambio climático y género, y por supuesto los avances en la implementación de las NDCs. Así que creo que todo esto que vamos a escuchar realmente va a ser de mucha utilidad para que eso no sean solo palabras y compromisos, sino puedan haber estrategias de implementación reales. Muchas gracias, Ramiro, y que quedo escuchando junto a todas la sesión.
Gracias, Cecilia, por tus comentarios. Me parece que da para que nos sentemos a pensar un poco. Es interesante varias cosas que dijiste. Una es que estamos en un momento de aprendizaje entre pares acá, ¿no? Entonces también este proyecto logra esas cosas. No es tan claro saber qué políticas funcionan y cuáles no. Estamos en ese proceso de pensar políticas, cuáles son escalables, cuáles no. Digo, y trabajar en equipo multirregional como hicimos en este proyecto creo que es una buena forma de conseguir esos resultados. Y lo segundo que también mencionabas, y que nada más quiero saltar ya para antes de entrar a la primera mesa de América Latina, es que estamos discutiendo, y estos temas, como bien dijiste vos, están en la agenda, pero tienen que llegar también a la agenda de los banqueros centrales. O sea, tiene que entrar a la agenda de las finanzas internacionales a gran escala, de los organismos multilaterales de crédito. Digamos que todavía ese diálogo entre el financiamiento para el desarrollo y el financiamiento de corto plazo que viene de Bretton Woods y toda esa excepcionalidad, todavía ahí hay temas por saldar. Y los costos los suelen pagar los países en desarrollo. Entonces creo que es importante, y lo que vos dijiste también del G20 como lugar propicio, quizás para llevar estas discusiones, establecer esos diálogos también, para que finanzas para el desarrollo y las finanzas de préstamos al Banco Central no sean discusiones separadas. Tienen que ser parte de la misma discusión. Bueno, entonces dejo nomás eso planteado, que complementa un poco lo que decía Cecilia, y vamos a entrar ya en la primera mesa, que va a resumir primero el marco conceptual, que como bien decía Cecilia, Fernando y Luis Miguel Galindo estuvieron desarrollando en los últimos años y que discutimos en este proyecto, y después va a ir a los estudios casos de América Latina. Así que Fernando Lorenzo, que es el líder del proyecto que estamos contando, si estás por ahí, te dejo la mesa virtual.
Bueno, muy buenos días. Gracias, Ramiro. Para poder ingresar directamente en la presentación de los temas, vamos a cederle la palabra a Luis Miguel, que va a hacer una presentación no solo del contexto general del proyecto realizado con el apoyo de la IDRC, sino de los resultados que tienen más relevancia desde la perspectiva del conjunto de la región, relativo a la gestión de la deuda, la fiscalidad y los objetivos de la transición climática, entendida esta como un tema no exclusivamente ambiental, sino en un concepto más amplio, que es el de transición climática justa, que incluye y conecta con los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible, y en una región tan desigual como América Latina, estos temas adquieren una relevancia muy especial. Así que, sin más, yo ya le cedo la palabra a Luis Miguel, y después vamos a escuchar las presentaciones del equipo de Paraguay, del equipo de Bolivia, y quizás sintéticamente en último, para ahorrar tiempo lo más rápidamente posible, también vamos a hacer algunas consideraciones acerca de los resultados del estudio para Honduras. Así que, Luis Miguel, tenés la palabra, ajustémonos a no mucho más de 15 minutos, pero adelante, por favor.
All right. Thank you. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, yes.
Yeah?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Well, as Fernando mentioned it, this is a work we have been doing with Fernando and Ramiro and under this project. I'm just going to go very fast in the results, so I'm glad to discuss later of the results and specific cases. No, but basically what we will try to prove in this study, and I'm going to put the main hypothesis that we have, is that essentially, of course, we have a problem in Latin America with COVID that is expressed in a different, very difficult conditions in fiscal sustainability and the debt management. That is, it gets worse, the conditions. However, in Latin America, after that condition, there was been a sort of adjustment policy try to control the fiscal conditions in Latin America and the management of the public debt. However, it hasn't been completely successful, as we can see now in Argentina, and there are other examples that are close to very difficult conditions in the management of their fiscal conditions and in their public debt. But I'm going to try to show you very briefly that that's not enough for Latin America for the conditions that we have the global economy in the 21st century. That is, it's not enough to have a short-term adjustment in public finances and public debt if we don't consider the long-term adjustments and the specific conditions that we have, as we can consider in the style of development in Latin America. That is, the actual conditions in Latin America doesn't allow the public finances and the public debt to fulfill and contribute to the results of the climate change goals and the climate transition. And moreover, if we keep on doing what we are doing, we are probably in a worse situation because these climate conditions and the just transition will affect the particular conditions to make the transition to this climate new economy. Just going to be very brief. There is a lot of things that they are pressing, as Ramiro already said, the public finance in Latin America, high interest rates, and different aspects. However, I'm just going to concentrate in what happened with climate change in particular and how it's very difficult that the way we are dealing now with the public finance in Latin America can deal with this climate change transition. I'm just going to go very fast on these conditions. I mean, Latin America is not, I mean, the income, fiscal income is more or less, I mean, it's not a lot considering the big developing countries. However, it's more or less under sustainable conditions. We have nevertheless a public expenditure higher. And what happened during the pandemic and afterwards is that basically the conditions they were getting worse. However, we have a primary deficit to try to control this situation. And of course, when we see the public debt as a percentage of GDP, it increased of course, the percentages given the actual conditions. However, it's still under not, I mean, for the general region, not completely in a disorder, but we have episodic cases of special countries that we are getting into the difficult conditions to manage these public finances and public debt. But in these conditions, I will just try to talk more on climate change and try to show you how it will impact the fiscal conditions in Latin America. In the right side, we have what we say what will be the conditions to achieve the climate change agreement, the Paris Climate Change Agreement. Basically, what we see, I mean, we can discuss a lot of that graph, but basically what we see is that if we want to keep the compromise not to have a temperature increase more of 1.5 or 2 degrees in this century, we need to become carbon neutral economies in between 2050 and 2070. That means that we need to change completely our type of economies. Because if we see, and we show in the study, that what we have got in Latin America in our style of development was what it was, we grow the GDP, or the gross domestic product, increase during the last 2 or 3 decades. However, that implies as well, of course, an increase in consumption, investment, a reduction in poverty. However, it was not the sufficiency, this type of development, to solve poverty, chronic poverty problems, a very concentrated income distribution, and moreover, it generates as well a very complex, externally negative matrix, no? Which includes the climate change. So basically, we have a style of development that is generating their own problems, and they are erosionating the base of sustainability of this type of development. These negative externalities as increasing high pollution, local atmospheric conditions and accidents, the pollution of water, whatever, and the generation of climate change is getting difficult to keep with the same dynamics that we have already. No? As well, we know that the way that we are using the natural resources is not a sustainable way in the long term. However, we need to change all this, and it implies significantly a structural change in our style of development. And therefore, our political, our public policies should be according with this requirement of change, of the structural change of the economy. And when we see in the left part, how are these scenarios, we have different type of scenarios to arrive to the carbon neutral economy, but basically it does imply the complete change in our style of development in the next years. And for example, just to put the case, we put just the carbon price that we expect to have if we don't have overall policy, but the carbon price, and it basically goes to between 300 and 700 price, the ton, I mean, the price of the ton of carbon. So it really implies a complete different ball game in the next few years in the global economy. When we begin to see what happened with this style of development, there is a lot of evidence that shows that basically already climate change is affecting the rate of growth of the GDP in general in the global economy, but in particular in countries that they are not, they are more with a higher temperature, and they are not very, I mean, they are not development. Basically, what we have is that an increase of 1 degree of temperature, it will impact between 1 or 2% reduction in the GDP in the future. So that implies significant and huge physical impacts of the climate change in the level of activity, and therefore, of course, in the reduction of the fiscal revenue. So in this case, we can see a lot of risks that we are facing that fiscal policy need to adjust in the next few years. First, we have all these fiscal impacts that it will impact the general economy, and it will have as well a significant impact in the way we know that this increase normally the public deficit because we need more expenditure to solve this problem, but as well we have a reduction in the fiscal revenue. Second, we are facing a significant stranded assets in the region. That is, there are countries in the region that have a significant oil and gas production, such as Bolivia, Ecuador, Mexico, Venezuela, etc., that they are going to lose if we fulfill the climate change agreement, the Paris Climate Change Agreement. They will basically need to reduce or abandon the production of oil and gas production in the next 30 or 50 years. That implies a significant fiscal revenue reduction. And if that's the case, they need to have a different alternative to fulfill this fiscal revenue. Otherwise, they're going to have a significant and not, of course, not sustainable public deficit in their accounts. We have as well a problem with the consumption fossil fuels taxes, because in the region there is a lot of revenue in a lot of these countries that they come from the taxes that we have already in fossil fuels, basically for transport. If the climate change agreement happens, then we will not have this money coming. And four, we have as well, of course, a lot of political games with the subsidies to consumption subsidies in gasoline and how we do it and how we expect to keep on doing that in the next few years. And we need as well an increase of the public expenditures to fulfill the just climate transition in the next few years. Given these situations, we need to change completely the paradigm that we are using now for the public fiscal conditions and the way we manage our public debt. If we don't change that and we really not incorporate these criteria of the climate change under the management of the fiscal policy and the public debt, it will be very difficult that we can manage to support this climate just transition in the next few years. We need to put that as a permanent condition and on top of the agenda of the management of these public policies. Basically, when we see what will happen, for example, to put two cases, and Cecilia was already mentioning it, we need, for example, basically around 5% of the GDP is between 2 and 8, but basically, let's say 5% of the GDP to invest in infrastructure of energy, transport, communications, and water to fulfill the demands of the sustainable development. And we need as well about 2 and 5% of the GDP for improving the social conditions, which implies a sort of work of universal parts. And in this condition, as well as Cecilia was already mentioning, when we see we need to fulfill what we say in Latin America, un sistema de cuidados, which implies a care system for children and adults as well into the system, it will cost around 2% of the GDP. So this amount of money that we really need to require to fulfill in the next few years is not possible to do it under the actual paradigm. We need to change fundamentally how we are dealing with the fiscal policy, the public debt, and how is the participation of the private sector. That is, we need to think of a way to get much more resources from different parts to have this the public finance under the control in the next few years. And of course, if we want to keep these systems sustainable in the long term, we need to have a financial sustainability. No? It's impossible to think to have all these sistema de cuidados on place if we don't have the financial conditions to keep it for a long term. No? This financial, the support of this sistema de cuidados is a fundamental step to develop a more gender equality system, because it will have, in a lot of sense, several bonuses or what they call it the triple dividend in the economy. That is, the development of this system will help, of course, the children and the old people, but as well, it will have an impact, a boost in the dynamic of the economy, and as well in the women, as they can not advocate a lot of their times to take care of the children and the old people, they can go in a much better conditions to the formal labor market, and it will reduce, in a lot of sense, the gaps that we have already now in gender participation and in salaries gaps. In this sense, the one option that we explored in the study was what will be the green of environmental tax in Latin America and what's the relevance for that. What we have in the results is that it's relevant, but there are two strings that we should consider. The first one is that I'm sorry to use the economic term, but the price sensibility of these reforms, which means the sensibility of gasoline to the new tax, they are not very big in Latin America. They are smaller than in Europe. So a price or a tax in these things, it will have to control the negative externality, but it won't be enough. However, this low sensibility will be a good point to increase fiscal revenue, in particular if we use sort of carbon price or carbon taxes in this case. In this context, we need to have a counter-cyclical action in the region, but it wouldn't be disassociated with the climate change action. The amount of resources that I showed before, they are so huge that we cannot have two policies at the same time, as an environment policy, and the other one a counter-cyclical action. They should be together, and that was I was arguing before. We should have a close and a convergence between the green and climate objectives and the counter-cyclical action in Latin America. In this case, we need to think that it's impossible to see in the next few years a just climate transition if we can still using the same fiscal and public debt paradigm. We need to change it substantially for two main reasons. First, because in the way we are doing now with this fiscal paradigm and public debt, it will be impossible to make the just climate transition in time. But second, and I think it's as well an important fact, is when we see all the impacts that it will have the fiscal policy and the public debt in the next few years because of the stranded assets risk, because of the physical climate change risk, it won't keep the fiscal situation on balance. If we don't move to this kind of new situation, we won't be able to support the climate transition, but as well we will have more recurrent fiscal and debt crisis in the next few years. So basically, we need to begin to think of the fiscal policy and the public debt in a much more broad way and incorporating completely and in the center of the discussion all these sustainable goals and the climate change impacts and risks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luis Miguel. You adjust very well to your time. So we continue with the presentation of the Bolivian country study. The team of ARU, you have the floor. Okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of Bolivian team, I would like to make a short presentation about fiscal policy, public debt in the transition to carbon neutrality, in the case of Bolivia. The purpose of this presentation is to make a big picture of public finance and to know the changes of Bolivia vis-a-vis of the climate change. Over the last 2 decades, Bolivia has shown a positive economic performance, an annual GDP growth rate around 3% in average, per capita GDP expansion of almost 2%. The poverty has reduced from the beginning of the 20th century until 2021, landing on 11%. The moderate poverty landing on 36%. However, Bolivia still has one of the highest informal labor rates in the region. 80% of the occupied population is informal. The country is highly dependent on gas production and exports. Bolivia has not only been affected by the pandemic, but also by social and political conflict after the last quarter of 2019. In 2021, the economy has grown 6% after the recession registered in 2020 because of the pandemic, mostly thanks to the expansion of the internal demand. In 2021, the new government decided to boost the economy through public investment. The socioeconomic development plan expects to invest over $33 billion addressed for productive infrastructure and social sector. In the first 2 years, it has executed over 20% of the amount. The price of stability depends partially on subsidies on food and energy. For this reason, any measure that attempt to reduce the fiscal cost of subsidies could entail high political and social costs. The fiscal balance shows a deficit stance the last 9 years, including public corporation, which is associated to a decrease of fiscal income and rigidities in the government expenditure. In the one hand, the fiscal revenues has become down because of low investment in the hydrocarbon sector and the fall down in the oil prices. On the other hand, public expenditure is almost similar the last decade due to some rigidities in the purchasing of the goods and services and salaries component. As I mentioned before, the lower production of gas and the price of WTI will condition Bolivians' growth in the short and the middle run. The share of the gas and petroleum has been reduced in GDP, exports, and fiscal revenues as well. As a result, the public debt started to grow quickly the past 5 years, both the external and internal. However, in terms of the GDP, are still below the international threshold. The lower growth for the next year, compared with those obtained before the pandemic, macroeconomic imbalance and composition of public debt spending are some of the most important limitations for Bolivia in order to move toward carbon neutrality in the 2050-2070 horizon. The government strategy consists of industrialization of some of the current goods that are imported to continue with the fuel subsidy in the short term to keep inflation in check. The government is aiming to produce biofuels based on palm oil, for example. The lithium extraction play a crucial role. Actually, the current investment in the sector is around $1 billion of US dollar. So the country changes are related on how to maintain a fiscal balance and to boost the economy in the short run, and how to become socially inclusive and environmentally friendly in the short run. According to the plan, 75% of the energy must be renewable at the end of 2025. Let's move on some projection of our baseline scenario. There are 3 ideas to keep in mind. First one, the fiscal balance is high, but with a correctional trend. Second, despite the moderation of fiscal imbalance, the dynamic of total public debt will continue to expand. Finally, external debt could be constrained by tighter external monetary conditions, which is a concern not only by fiscal reason, but also for maintain the exchange rate policy and support the international reserves. In this scenario, the principal source of public financing will be the domestic, including the central bank, of course. We built some scenarios that are simulate taking into account depreciation of 5% in the local currency, 3% of GDP growth in 2023. That is a little bit optimistic right now. Reduction of fiscal deficit in 1% for the next 5 years. A 0.5% of increase in the interest rate of foreign debt. And the last one, increase in 15% in the interest rate on local currency debt. Well, The results suggest that even if the fiscal balance is reduced in the coming years, the public debt is exposed a new debt cycle. Several shocks that will lead to the situation of debt and sustainability. For example, the depreciation of local currency causing the public debt GDP ratio to reach more than 100% at the end of the 2027. In general, we expect that the debt will be increased at least 10% of GDP in the 5 years, next 5 years. When we carry out the decomposition of public debt, we find that the primary balance surplus is not enough to maintain a constant stock of debt. Look at the red bar. The other side, the international interest rate rise the debt, but not much. The GDP growth contributes to reduce the public debt, but is not enough. In order to check the different paths of external debt, we carry out a pie chart. The dark line in the middle predicts the most likely scenario, suggesting that the public debt as a share of GDP will reach 90%, while the most optimistic trajectory suggests that it could decrease to reach 70% of GDP in the lowest distribution. I'm gonna go to the last 2 slides just for make some recommendations. The Bolivian's energy transition is possible as long as macroeconomic conditions remain stable related to the fiscal deficit, exchange rate, public revenue, and public debt. Nevertheless, the climate transition finds the country in a period of a rapid decline in gas production that implies to accelerate the change of the energy matrix. The structure of Bolivia tax revenues is highly dependent on non-renewable energy that pollutes the environment. The implementation of a green tax reform is quite significant. Address the invest to prioritize expense in environmental and sustainable development terms are needed. Well, there are 2 potential ways to reduce these subsidies. Substitution of fossil fuels imports for domestic production of biofuels. Actually, the government is carrying out this policy and try to change the energy matrix as soon as possible. Gradual reduction of subsidies with a focus on social protection must be implemented. Another important factor for the future of a fiscal country is the lithium. Bolivia is one of the most important countries in terms of the reserves in the world. Bolivia needs to attract foreign investment to complement public investment. Allow redirection of gas production to the domestic market. Well, in summary, the Bolivian state still has room for the debt. The new financial instrument linked to environmentally preservation goals and sustainable consumption solution could be a positive impact on the economy. I stop here. I hope the presentation have been understanding. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Omar. It's very clear the presentation of the Bolivian experience. Now we pass the floor to Fernando Massi for the presentation of the Paraguayan country study. Fernando.
Okay, good morning. Do you see the presentation already? Well,
Yes.
okay. I'm going to talk basically about the fiscal results in Paraguay over the last decade, and what the implications were for specifically for their sustainability, and what are the scenarios for this debt sustainability. And then to combine these two results with the climate transition, and what would be the scenarios for climate transitions, and a balance fiscal the balanced fiscal results, as well as debt sustainability. I know. Yeah. Sorry, just a moment.
Ok.
Ya cambió, Fernando.
Okay. From 2020 to 2021 has been a deterioration of the fiscal balance in Paraguay. Specifically, this deterioration of the fiscal balance was because there was reducing tax revenues and non-tax revenues of the state. But at the same time, there has been an increase of public expenditures, specifically during the pandemic period. This increase in public expenditures was from 14 to 16% of the GDP. And in terms of debt, you see in the graph 2, there's a significant increase of this public debt, also from 9.1% of the GDP in 2010 to 31% and more in 2021. This for Paraguay, perhaps in comparison to other countries, in terms of debt ratio to GDP, 30% is already a big increase because of the low capacity of state payment and low tax pressure in Paraguay. When we're talking about sustainability of the public debt, we were building scenarios for evaluating these risks, and using in the 2023-2027 period, and we were using variables like GDP growth, fiscal surplus and deficit, interest rate of external and domestic debt, inflation and exchange rate. The base scenario of this for public debt is a plan of the Ministry of Finance that it can also coincides with the formulations of expectations coming from multilateral organizations on fiscal convergence in Paraguay. In this, you could see all the numbers of the variables that were put for this scenario, and as a result of that, the public debt would be the public debt GDP ratio would be the 33% for the whole period on average. In an optimistic scenario, of course, with GDP growth of 7.5% in this year, and then a growth of 3.8% in the following years, and then you have the other variables, the numbers for the variables. In this case, the public debt GDP ratio would remain under the 35% for the whole period. In a pessimistic scenario, and this is the very important one for fiscal policies and in the future in Paraguay, in this pessimistic scenario, with this 0.3% in 2023 and 1% in 2024, and then we use the 3.8% in the following years, the public debt to the GDP ratio is closing to, is very close to 41%, which is a number that is considered in Paraguay with non-manageable in terms of not only paying debt, but also in terms of negative impact on the fiscal balance and other in other parts of the macroeconomic context in Paraguay. So in this case, there would be a high vulnerability for fiscal sustainability because this is a threshold. 40% really is a threshold for public debt GDP ratio in Paraguay. When we talk about fiscal risk and climate transition, we did also scenarios. We did some calculation of scenarios for climate transition and growth and GDP growth and the emissions of greenhouse gases. And we will have basically three scenarios: the inertial scenario, which is the bow scenario, where there's going to be increasing growth of greenhouse emission, which is not compatible with the deep decarbonization of the economy. And 2050, and of course, these inertial scenarios would have great impacts on fiscal balance. In the orderly scenario, when you're having mitigation measures for climate change before 2030, and in this scenario, the impact will be less because it will be coincident with the global scenarios of decarbonization. So that you're using measures or fiscal measures to mitigate and adapt to climate transition or climate change. In a disorderly scenario, on the contrary, mitigation measures are postponed until 2030. So it would be it would mean greater efforts for the fiscal authorities in Paraguay for decarbonization. So this postponement of the mitigation measures could create a space for negative impact on the fiscal balance in Paraguay. Now, what about public debt in these scenarios for climate transition and fiscal risks? Here, we assumed an annual GDP growth of 3.5 that decreases to 2.5 near the 2050 because of the effect of climate change. And then we calculate an annual increase of global temperature in the order of 0.04 grades centigrades to reach 1 degree centigrade at the end of the year. I mean, at the 2050. So the first scenario, without climate change, without any measures, I mean, without if we suppose there is no climate change, then the fiscal balance and the public debt remain stable. In the second scenario, when you have a climate change with this inertial bow scenario, then the impact on public income will be greater than the impact on public expenses. There will be an increased fiscal deficit of 6% of GDP near to 2050. And the debt GDP ratio would increase more than 100% by the same year. And here, it should be said that 100% is a really high number for the GDP ratio in Paraguay. That so even before the 2050, if this is the if we have this scenario and the increase of the debt it reaches 40 or 50%, it would already before 2050 have negative impacts on fiscal balance in Paraguay. And then you have the orderly and disorderly scenarios for climate transition that, of course, with harmful effects on public finance and debt sustainability, especially if you don't, if we don't have any increase of tax and non-tax revenues in Paraguay, because for these scenarios, you would need to increase public investment equal to 2 to 3.5% of the GDP to confront social problems, to confront needed infrastructure in energy, in infrastructure, especially in terms of energy. So if there's no increase in tax and non-tax revenues, the effects on public finance would be, and debt sustainability would be very harmful. And finally, the scenario for green fiscal reform, and when we suppose that there would be an income increase of tax on fiscal income equivalent to 2% of the GDP. This would mean that there's a possibility of putting tax or carbon tax or other type of taxes for social problems, for climate transitions, and for other needs of the state in Paraguay because of the climate change. Then if we have this income increase of 2% of the GDP, we are going to have moderate public spending at the same time, the public debt path that provides more flexibility in managing fiscal policies. So this is the last scenario. And what about the policy implications of this whole the exercise of this path to climate transition and fiscal risk in Paraguay? In the first of all, we need to increase tax pressure with new taxes or increased taxes rates of existing taxes in order to prevent simultaneous negative shocks in a pessimistic scenario that we observed before in the 23 and 27 period. And that in terms of debt, additional public revenues could be achieved through taxes on, especially on fuels and in Paraguay, because fuels, if you see the energy matrix in Paraguay, it is a paradox, because only 18% of the energy matrix we have renewable sources used to consumed in Paraguay. That means hydroelectric energy, while the supply of hydroelectric energy is more than 60% of the total supply of energy in Paraguay. So 41% of this matrix is consumption of fuels, and another 41% is consumption of biomass. So here we have to do something in order of taxes on fuels, but also in order of using more our renewable sources that we are in a very privileged position in Paraguay because of this hydroelectric energy, a lot of hydroelectric energy that we have as a supply of energy in Paraguay that could replace the use of petroleum and the use of gas, specifically in terms of transportation. And finally, also financial resources. Like I said before, the hydroelectric energy, it's not only a big renewable source of supply of energy in Paraguay, but also could finance, especially after the negotiations with Brazil of the Itaipu hydroelectric dam, which is binational. It could be a very good source of financing the climate transition. But besides that, that possibility, Paraguay has to also look for other sources of financial resources, like thematic bonus and loans linked to environmental and climate objectives. So this will help the management of public debt. So it could be a combination of financing from the big hydroelectric dam that we have in the border with Brazil, and also looking for other type of financial sources that are now in the market and in the future, like Ramiro said when he was referring to the different sources and prospective different sources of financial resources for climate change in the global south. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fernando. We continue with the presentation of the Honduras country study. Luis Miguel, if you can have a very brief presentation to adjust to our time, to the time of the program. Thank you very much, Luis Miguel.
Yeah, perfect. You can see the presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Well, basically, I'm just going to put the main points as in the general discussion that we have got. No? In Honduras, it shows perfectly the conditions of what we have been talking about. They have economic growth in the last 3 decades or 4 decades, and of course, improve the consumption, investment, and social conditions. However, this dynamism was insufficient to solve chronic poverty problems, high concentration of income distribution, and public debt. No? So they faces a very complex conditions that they haven't solved this, but they have not very secure fiscal and public debt conditions, and they have as well generate a very complex negative matrix externality. So in order to solve these problems, fiscal conditions and public debt need to be changed in the paradigm to solve these parts and incorporate the structural conditions of Honduras as this level of poverty, and considering that if they don't change this paradigm, the policy won't be enough, the fiscal policy, to address a just climate transition, and even more, it will receive significant impacts from the climate change, so the current fiscal conditions, it will be unsustainable in the long term, because it will have, for example, physical climate change impact as climate events in Honduras that they are very significant. In this sense, I'm just going very fast. I mean, that shows this, what I just say, no? There have been this increase in private consumption and in Honduras. However, it's interesting to see that the public investment in Honduras has gone down, and we need to change that pattern in the next few years. And for that, we need a much solid fiscal conditions. No? It shows that, of course, the poverty and Gini index is pretty bad in Honduras, and the public deficit has been trying to control. However, the public debt is still, I mean, even they have an arrangement a few years ago, is still under bearable conditions, but difficult to keep it in the long term, especially if we consider this climate change path. But when we see what are the challenges ahead of Honduras, it shows, for example, when we see the greenhouse emissions, that they will really need to change to have this neutral CO2 economy in 2050 and 2070, significant change in their energy efficiency and the decarbonization case. And of course, when we see the possibility of a green fiscal policy, it's possible to have it and to have a second dividend in the income distribution. However, as it's very concentrated, the income, there are some caveats we need to consider in the policy in Honduras. So basically, that shows that Honduras faces complex situations because they haven't been able to solve in the way their actual style of development. There are problems in the fiscal and debt conditions, but ahead they are facing very complex problems to make the transition. They need to change the paradigm because the fiscal risk associated to climate change, they are significant in the economy, and they need to address it to make possible this climate just transition in the next few years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luis Miguel. Now we have Walter Wall from IDRC for the comments about the regional research and the specific country studies.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Thank you, everyone. Really, I'm really glad to be part of this. I think that is really a critical research, the one that you have been undertaking, in particular because there is South-South effort that is maybe bringing the first experience of research at this level, that there is a big gap. But then I was just listening carefully to all those presentations. In particular, I'm just focusing what that Galindo said. So it said that more or less in the LAC region, there is a debt that is under control. Even the impact of the post-COVID would have represented in natural budget. So, and then we say that we have a scenario that we need to change the style of life, style of the new development. But we have the reality that the Paris Agreement is putting really in serious problem some of our economy just to accomplish with those commitments. In particular, those that are just producer of primary sources. In the geographical, geopolitical, and historic context that we are in the region, if we are putting all those things and the impact of the debt services in the GDP, the same, that will be really a serious challenge for most of the countries to undertake the next committed for the energy transition and all level of demand that we have. Lorenzo said, Latin America is one of the most unequal regions that we have in the world. And then Cecilia said, yes, and we need an investment of 5% on infrastructure just to respond to the demands. If we look to the state of the institutional financial institute, what they are discussing, what they are now thinking in how to be more proactive with this, when we have this international climate finance framework where the rich countries has failed again to meet with the pledges, we say that the landscape is not so easy. So Galindo said we need a new style of development, we need to adjust to new challenges. However, there is a serious problem of illiquidity in most of the countries just to afford this. And the last G20 declaration was asking that should be a reform in the financial system just to respond to most of that, because most of the low and medium income countries won't be able to respond to the crisis that we have after the pandemic, and now that we have the Russian invasion to Ukraine. So we have that most of the bilateral debt are related to China. China is not so flexible to accept some of new situation. Private sector in our region is not active, is not ready even to play the role that at the international level we are they are asking. So if we look to this to say that with regard to, so we have many countries that have been starting to implement carbon taxes. We have Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and others. The challenge to deal with carbon tax is not easy if we are not changing all the structure of our economy, Galindo says. And in this regard, we have really also that national government, national budget are not related to the commitment that countries are taking at the global level. Even if we see which is the way that now how it's still in the climate change impact in our national budget, there is no doubt. Not when we have drought, then we have flood, and then we have the problem and the cost of natural disaster. There is no way how we can be distilling in new national budget. It doesn't respond. The last climate change that happened in September in Nairobi, there was a strong declaration from the African Union that was telling that we need to change, and most of those that it was a climate change was regarding to the debt. They were asking just for a rescheduling of the debt. This is critical. So this month, at the end of this month, in Panama City will take place the Climate Change Week, the LAC, the Latin American and Caribbean Climate Change Week, where the Minister of Environment will have the forum. Maybe will come, not similar one, but we are dealing with it. But at the end of the day, governments, national government, are really dealing with the problem that they don't know how to deal just with those big commitment, global commitment, and trying to distill in national policy. Because I'm representing here IDRC, and we are also having our agenda when we are allocating funds for research, which is quite important and crucial for national group of researchers. We are also bringing, as Cecilia said, this transition needs to be just, needs to be inclusive, needs to be sustainable, and we can add. So the demand that we have, however, now the diagnosis that this project has been bringing a strong evidence is clear. But how we can really downscale the diagnosis to real tools that will enable national government at the local level to have their own tool to deal with those new challenges. So I want to ask you, do you consider that with the tools that national government have, they can really undertake a new policy that will be responding? And when there is maybe a gap on which is the level of tools that national at the local level are able to deal with these challenges. So this is my reflection, and I want just to finish with this question that for me is critical at this time. How we deal at the local level with a new tool to face the climate challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Walter. A very good reflection and a good question that we can integrate it in the final block of the program. And now we continue with the African country studies. Ramiro, you can
yes,
begin.
Thank you, Fernando, for this. And just I think that we learned from these Latin American cases that we will need huge amounts of developing finance, in the next years. But we are also experiencing this reduction in the thresholds for public debt to GDP ratio. So, we need to think about come up with innovative solutions, even locally, and then for financial institutions as well. So there's a huge contradiction between both trends. So, and with this contradiction, we are moving to Africa. Of course, we have different levels of development, different demography, different relationships with the international finance institutions as well. So I think that we also can learn from the cases of Nigeria, Uganda, and Ethiopia in these 45 minutes to come. So we are running late, so I just will ask Mara Echenuke from the Center for the Study of Economics of Africa to start talking about the Nigerian case study. Of course, we will hear a lot about this debt for nature swaps and so on. So Ma, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ramiro. I'm sharing my screen. Please let me know if you can see it.
Yes, we can see your screen.
All right, great. Hello, everyone. Today I'll be presenting the 3 papers that we carried out with the help of IDRC under the broad topic of debt management and fiscal policy for sustainable development. So just to provide a bit of background before we go into the findings of the papers. Debt has consistently increased in Nigeria in the past decade. So we've seen public debt as a share of GDP increase from about 18% in 2012 to 38% in the first quarter of 2023. Now, most of this increments has been caused by increases in external debts. So we've seen external debts now account for 40% of total debts in 2023, as opposed to about 14% of total debts in 2012. So external debts, think about issuances of Eurobonds, also, borrowing from non-Paris Club creditors, China, debts like that. Now, with regards to the creditor composition of the external debts, multilateral and private debts represents a large share of public debts in the Nigerian context. So the red block is multilateral debts and the yellow block is private debts, while the blue block is bilateral debt. We can see how the blue block has considerably reduced from 2000 to 2020. So debt from other countries, the US, the UK, Germany, for instance, bilateral debt has consistently reduced. Meanwhile, we've seen debt from multilateral creditors, World Bank, AFDB, increasing again. Like I mentioned, private debt issuances of Eurobonds has increased. So presently, multilateral debt accounts for about 48% of total debts. Private debt accounts for about 38%, and the remaining 14% or so is allocated to bilateral debts. Now, there are important implications with the changing creditor landscape in Nigeria's borrowing. So when you borrow from private creditors, you see you have higher interest rates, also shorter maturity and grace periods. Also, those kinds of debts, both bilateral and both private and multilateral debts, do not frequently lend themselves to debt restructuring. So an example is the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, which was put in place by the international community, G20 countries, World Bank, IMF. And what we saw was that private creditors hardly participated in the DSSI initiative. So they did not halt debt service obligations for eligible countries. Only one private creditor, I think, participated. And so for this reason, because of the rapid pace in debt accumulation, and also because of our changing creditor landscape, the fact that we've been borrowing mostly from private and multilaterals, we've seen interest payments skyrocket. in the last couple of years. So in 2022, for instance, 96%, 96% of our federal government revenue was allocated just for interest payments, and so that left really nothing for us to spend on other sectors. And so this graph shows the 2020 the budget shares for key sectors for 2021, 2022, and 2023. And what we can immediately see is that debt servicing dwarfs the very important sectors, whether we're talking about health, education, infrastructure, social development, and poverty reduction. Debt servicing, these sectors come, they don't come close in any way to the amounts we spend on debt servicing. So we spent about, in 2023, we spent about 29% of our budgets on debt servicing. Education had 8%, infrastructure 6%, health just 5%, And so for this reason, the research community in Nigeria, and more specifically in CC, the center where I work, Center for the Study of the Economies of Africa, we started to think through the issues that we were facing and see how we can provide solutions to stem the debt crisis and at the same time address other development needs. So climate issues, for instance, gender equality as well. So how we can, provide multi-dimensional solutions basically to our debt, climate, and developmental challenges. And so we got funding from the IDRC and we started the 3 paper projects in the beginning of 2022. The first project, or the first paper, was debt for climate swaps in Nigeria. So basically what this paper does is that it examines the Nigeria situation and shows how there is a need for us to address the debt and climate issues that the country is currently facing. And more importantly, it shows how viable a debt swap program would be if we were to undertake one. What are debt swaps? Debt swaps are basically buying back debt at a discount and then using some of the savings for climate smart policies or projects or programs. So basically, in other words, it means agreeing with your creditor to reduce debt service obligations, and then in exchange for that, using the money to invest in climate projects. So that's basically what debt swaps are. And what the paper does is that we use a scenario analysis to look at how much we can eligibly gain if we undertake debt swaps. So first, we use the baseline scenario where all ODE eligible Paris Club debts and worst performing Eurobonds will be swapped. The second scenario is the optimistic scenario where all Paris Club debts and worst performing Eurobonds and in addition, all multilateral concessional debts will be swapped. And then the third scenario is where only ODE eligible Paris Club debts will be swapped. Now, what made us choose these different categories of debts under the different scenarios? It was based on historical precedents. So historical precedents and also economic rationale. So basically, in the past, the categories of debts that have been swapped more frequently are ODE eligible Paris Club debts and then worst performing Eurobonds. And in very rare cases, we've had multilateral concessional debts being swapped. This paper was done together with researchers from Brookings Institution, the Africa Growth Initiative. And what we found was that for the optimistic scenario, Nigeria can gain up to $11.8 billion if we decide to undertake debt swaps. which is a considerable share of our nationally determined contributions. So basically that will help us a long way in achieving our climate objectives. The second paper was on determining the optimal carbon tax policy in the Nigerian context. It was done in collaboration with the Environment for Development Initiative. They are residents in University of Nigeria and Nsukka. They have a first-rate climate change research team. Now, what the second paper seeks to examine is first to determine the scope of taxation if we were to implement a carbon tax. So basically, what sectors are we going to be looking at? Second, to determine the point of regulation. Are we going to be looking at what is best for us, given our country idiosyncrasies? Is it a production tax or is it consumption tax? And then third, what is the best optimal tax rates in order for us to achieve certain carbon levels, and also in order for us to generate certain revenue for the country. Again, we use a scenario analysis based on production tax, consumption tax, also the removal of fuel subsidy. That's implicit in all the scenarios, and then finally household transfer, just to alleviate the impact of tax. And what we found was that what would be best for us is to have a phased carbon tax regime. First, implement a consumption tax, and then subsequently implement a production carbon tax of 10%, which is scenario 6. And then afterwards, put in place household transfer schemes. So basically, cash programs, just to alleviate the burden on the most vulnerable households. Under scenario 6, we find that carbon emissions will be curbed by 2.4 million tons, and also we can generate up to 4.3 trillion naira, which is equivalent to $57.6 billion under scenario 6. Scenario 6 to us is our optimal scenario, not necessarily because it generates the highest revenue. For instance, in scenario 1, we can see that we can generate up to 7.5 trillion naira. But scenario 6, we decided on scenario 6 because it doesn't have as much negative impact on other key economic indicators. So we looked at unemployment, the impact of tax on unemployment, poverty, inflation, economic output as well. So in as much as we want to curb carbon emissions and also increase revenue as much as possible, we also don't want to negatively overwhelm the economy. So in that sense, or for those reasons, scenario 6 was what we decided on as the most optimal tax regime, carbon tax regime. The table presents, the findings for each scenario, what we would gain in government revenue, what we would gain, how much carbon emissions will be cut for each scenario. Before I continue, I'm glad to say that the Nigerian government is actually now considering implementing both policy instruments. So the debt for climate swaps, the former Vice President Osibanjo, Yemi Osibanjo, in a policy statement, he said, the government was considering undertaking debt for climate swaps. And more recently, in March of 2023, the National Climate Council of Nigeria, they're talking about introducing a carbon tax, and we included them as one of the key stakeholders when we're beginning this study. When we launched the study earlier, about a month or 2 months ago, they were at the events and they've been part of the study. So, you know, we know that these studies have been instrumental and have been influential in Nigeria's policy space, which is a very good thing to see. Now, the third study is on examining the micro and macro effects of gender equality on economic development, more specifically on economic outputs and also on government revenue during the pandemic. Now, a lot of global public issues, whether it's pandemics, whether it's climate change, whether it's conflicts, for instance, they affect women more severely relative to their male counterparts, just because of the role that women play in the economy, in the society, and in politics. So, take for example, at the peak of the pandemic, when schools were no longer in session, physical brick and mortar schools were no longer in session. Women, being the primary caregivers, had more on their plates in terms of looking after children, homeschooling children, ensuring that children are in front of the computers. That's just one aspect. A lot of women also play, they're the key workers in informal economy, and particularly in the developing countries. Now, this informal economy, at the peak of the pandemic, they did not have it was difficult for the government to reach them in terms of giving them, you know, subsidy programs, or, you know, giving them any means to alleviate the burden that was associated with the pandemic. And so we've seen time and time again how women, even the fact that they are more active in certain sectors, services, for instance, trade, accommodation, and food services, you know, that negatively affects them as soon as disruptions to business as usual occurs. You know, as soon as any disruption to the economy occurs, women are more affected relative to their male counterparts. And so what we did was that we tried to look at how the gender inequality in the Nigerian context, how it affected economic development, how it affected revenue, and also economic output. Now, what we find is that in 2020, if we had gender equality scenarios, so under gender parity, rather than us having a decrease in growth of 1.8%, we would have rather had a decrease in growth of about 1.1%. In 2023, we would have had a recovery of 3.6%, and in 2024 we would have had a recovery of 3.4%. But rather, what we had, due to gender inequality issues, what we had was a growth of about 2.5%. Now, what this graph presents is government revenue as a share of GDP. So basically looking at the impacts of gender inequality on government revenue, and comparing what is reality based on gender inequality scenarios, and then what would happen if we were to achieve gender parity, right? So the yellow dots is projections, the yellow dots is estimations of government revenue as a share of GDP under gender parity. And what we see is that in 2020, during the pandemic, government revenue as a share of GDP, if gender parity was the case, would have been about 9%, but because of the gender inequality issues, what we see is that government revenue was about 7%. So that's a 2% gap. And so closing the gender gap in Nigeria has the potential of boosting economic output and increasing government revenue beyond present levels. Now, the key recommendations that the papers provide is that we have the opportunity to restructure debts to improve fiscal space for spending on key sectors. If we were to engage in debt for climate swaps, we'll be able to relieve up to $11.8 billion for climate spending. That's the maximum that we would be able to achieve. Third, if we were to implement a carbon tax, implementing a phased carbon tax, first consumption carbon tax, and then follow it up with production tax, can reduce carbon emissions by up to 2.4 million tons and also increase government revenue by about $57.6 billion. Now, to ensure gender parity, it's important that we improve at we don't necessarily lack laws in the gender policy space. What we lack is implementation and enforcement. So in terms of, for instance, land ownership, in terms of policies that favor caregiving, for instance, having an organization, working in an organization that provides a daycare, for instance, that's just one example. So those implementation of those policies are lacking. And if the reverse were to be the case, so if we were to implement those policies, we can potentially improve government revenue by up to 9% of GDP. And then finally, to alleviate the impact of a carbon tax on the most vulnerable households, it's important that we provide temporary, targeted, and timely assistance to households and firms. So those are the key policy recommendations and the key findings from our papers. Just as in conclusion, we co-authored, the researchers that were part of the project, we co-authored a blog post on the summary of the 3 papers, and it's available on the Brookings website. I'll drop the link in the chat box, and hopefully we can continue the conversation after this. Thank you so very much, and over to you, Ramiro. Thank you.
Thank you, Ma, for that, and you can share the blog post there in the chat. Well, I think that you just covered a lot of topics that we are working on. Of course, the dynamics of changing the structure of external debt is something that I think that is important to take into account. The emergence of China and other creditors, of private debt as well as something that is new for some countries in Africa. I think that's very interesting. Second, you just show with data these tough trade-offs, between spending in interest payments and educational health and so on. I think that these figures are just, it talks about the crisis, that's just too much. And then this idea of course, we can have an increase in public debt because of spending more on the clear economy, but we can also have some, gender bonus on the tax side, of the equation. So I think that we need to explore that in more detail and also think about Latin America under these terms. So now we're moving to Uganda. So Corti Paul Lakuma from the Economic Policy Research Center, are you there? The floor is yours.
All right, yeah, let me share my screen, and I thought I would be the last, but it's okay.
Oh, sorry.
But it's okay, I can do it. So can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, my name is Paul Lakuma, and I'm a senior research fellow with the Economic Policy Research Center. We did this paper with the Ministry of Finance of Uganda. So the title has changed severally, and this is the one we finally settled on: Sustainable, Inclusive, and Environmentally Responsive Debt in Uganda, Implications of COVID-19. The structure of my presentation, I'll go through the introduction, I'll give the results, and then I'll conclude and give some policy recommendations. So I'll start with the intro. So Uganda's debt has increased considerably in the last decade, just like you saw with the other cases which have been presented earlier. As I shall demonstrate later, there's a reason why the debt has increased in the last decade. And COVID-19 driven economic shocks call for a review and comparison with past responses for better policy outcomes, of course, so that we don't repeat the mistakes we made in the past, but also other issues have crept in, issues of inclusivity, transparency, and environmental sustainability, which have come to fore, given that debt repayment, as you have seen with high interest payments, crowd out expenditures on other critical sectors, and also crowd out like credit to MSMEs. And you know, MSMEs in this part of the world are owned by women and the youth who are more vulnerable. So I'll move to the results now. So the first graph on your left shows that the main story here is that the main story here in this chart is that debt has increased considerably, approaching the benchmark rate, which is 50%, but this has not been matched by development of institutional capacity, especially institutions which handle debt management, which handle policies for social inclusion, and structural policies and economic management. There's a score constructed by World Bank, that is a country policy and institutional assessment score. It compares country, and it's good. It's not. Some people debate against this comparison, but it's always good also to compare, to know where you are as a country. As you can see, Uganda is not doing so badly, but it's lagging behind Kenya and Rwanda, particularly, though it's above other IDA borrowers and other entrants to the East African community, that is DRC, South Sudan, and Burundi. Uganda is and Tanzania. Uganda is above those countries, but Uganda is below, particularly Rwanda, which is pretty in our conversations and in our context. Rwanda is a pretty young country. Uganda should be a little bit above. We would accept Kenya to be above us, but Rwanda, well, it shows there is room for improvement. The graph on your left shows the increase in debt. As you can see, before the 2010s, debt was really high. But then we underwent 2 periods of debt forgiveness in 6-7 and 09. That's why you can see debt dropped to about 17%. In 2010-11. But in 2010-11, we kind of had a policy shift where we left the poverty reduction strategy papers, which focused more on social sectors, and we moved into developing economic infrastructure, more into development. And then we went back to the 60s, what we used to do in the 60s, that is a 5-year development programs. And that came with heavy investments in the road and energy infrastructure. And that's why you see debt accumulating. Much of it was funded by debt. Front loading of debt based on Uganda is now, or it's going to be a new producer of hydrocarbons, that is oil and gas. It's going to be, I think, number 5 in Africa in terms of output, about 200,000 barrels a day. That is expected by 2025. And this debt has been accumulated on that promise. But you can see there's a contribution by debt which was borrowed to address COVID-19 related issues, about 6 percentage point. That's the difference here between 47 and 41% of GDP. to repeat again, all this accumulation has not been matched with institutional capacity development to manage these issues. The debt mix, just like any other country, of late, the influence of private creditors it's not as large, but it's becoming significant, and the influence of bilateral lenders also is becoming significant. That is mostly by China. But private lenders come with their own challenges. First of all, the interest rates are pretty higher than the benchmark rates. There's issues of transparency in the debt. But however, these two new lenders should be understood in the context of finite concession or multilateral sources. The amount of money held by concession or multilateral sources is not infinite. So China and private lenders become important in the debt matrix, because in the debt mix, because concessional debt is not infinite. It's a finite source, and our development goals, our development dreams are larger than the resources to finance that. That's how private lenders and China become important. Also, private lenders bring in another aspect in terms of rigor in analytics and expansive private networks. They know more people out there, people with money to lend, and they can also organize public-private initiatives better than if it's left alone to the government. And they also deepen the domestic market. We must confess that they help develop the domestic credit market. Our study also saw that debt could have positive effects under certain supportive conditions. On my left side, as interest payments, of course, have led to depreciation of the Ugandan currency by cumulatively to about 40% in the last. It's expected to reach 40% in the next 10 years. That's by 2032-33. We expect our domestic currency to depreciate cumulatively by 40%. This would be good if we had addressed other structural issues like industrialization. We had factories here, we are manufacturing, because then our currency is cheap and makes our exports cheap. But that's not the case. And the speed at which we are developing industries is also not encouraging. So this makes debt more expensive, because then we have a lot of Ugandan shilling chasing fewer, for now, US dollars, because we pay our external trade with US dollars. And this worsens our terms of trade. We saw also concessional debt could enhance tax collection, but this decays with time. For now, we can collect a combination of all the taxes: corporate, indirect, production taxes, household taxes, that is pay, and import taxes. We could collect up to 1% of GDP currently, but this will decay with time. Why? Because then by 2025, we will become an oil-producing country, and then we will not be eligible for a lot of concessional lending. So also, the impacts coming from concessional lending are expected to decay to less than 0.5 percentage point in the next 10 years. Issues of gender. We visited some debt finance projects. Most of them were in rural areas. Most of them, because they are dealing with addressing the country infrastructural gap. Those are roads and energy projects. Most of them are in rural areas. And these projects also require a lot of energy, a lot of heavy lifting. So a lot of these jobs are to the rural, first of all, people. And then a lot of them are to male gender. So a lot of women are being left behind in terms of acquisition of jobs, which are debt related, at least direct acquisition of job, not indirect, but direct acquisition of jobs, which are debt related. Moving on to environmental issues, we estimate that the contribution of carbon emissions is expected to rise. Carbon emission related to debt as we commercialize oil and gas resources. Right now, the biggest contributor to climate change in Ugandan context is methane, because we do a lot of agriculture. Methane is related to a lot of agricultural activity, but we expect carbon emissions or carbon-related activities to increase by 2032 to explain more than half of the total carbon emissions, which is expected to be 16.1 of million metric tons of carbon equivalent emissions. Also, a lot of the projects which are debt funded in Uganda fortunately to water and water for production and water for consumption activities. So debt has a positive story in Uganda that it's increasing the sources of fresh water, because a lot of the projects are to provide water for production in agriculture and water for consumption by households. So, we expect by 2032 debt to contribute to delivery of fresh water sources up to 61 metric tons by 2032. That's what we expect to get cumulatively. Debt could also worsen pollution of fresh water. That's what our simulation here suggests, and we expect debt-related projects to contribute to pollution of freshwater sources by up to 17 million metric tons by 2032. That is in the next 10 years. We also simulated how to mitigate the impacts of debt-related climate change and carbon emissions. And we found that a carbon tax, we simulated a 20% carbon tax. Why 20%? It's in the range of the effective tax rate for excise duty, which is meant to combat production of items or consumables which have an externality to the society. That things like cigarettes, alcohol consumption, and sugary drinks. So, and also hydrocarbons. We already have a carbon tax, only that it's not called a carbon tax. We have a tax on plastics, all the way from goonie bags to petroleum products and petroleum itself, petroleum and diesel. We already have a carbon tax in Uganda, only that we don't call it like that. We just call it an excise duty. So we simulated a 20% carbon tax on energy carriers, and we found that we could reduce emissions by 13,560 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. However, we found that imposition of a carbon tax could increase the cost of production for most of the industries here. And the tax, which is generated from the 20% imposed on hydrocarbons, it's about 400 billion by 2032-33. But the impacts or the cost of adjustment, or because the adjustment is inelastic, it doesn't happen so quickly. It's very difficult to change from a carbon carrier or a carbon emitting carrier to a green energy driven production line. The cost of adjustment it's half of the tax contribution. So about 200 billion could be part of the cost of adjustment. So now we move to conclusion and policy recommendations. One, we saw that increase in debt is not matched by institutional capacity. We saw the increase in influence of new creditors who complicate the debt management spectrum. We saw that debt could enhance tax collection and exports under the right conditions if you address the structural issues. But if you don't, then the terms of trade, because of the collapse or the depreciation of the exchange rate, could affect your country badly if you don't industrialize as fast. We saw also debt is increasingly benefiting more men than women. And we saw carbon emissions and water pollution increases in debt, but also debt is providing more fresh water sources. What are our policy recommendations? Of course, we need to address capacity issues in analytics, policy management and governance for Uganda and other developing countries. More bilateral deliberative mechanism to ensure transparency and accountability, especially from the new creditors, China and the private lenders. We also need to utilize more debt to develop economic structures, of course, manufacturing capacity to take advantage of the depreciation of the domestic currency, because then our exports become cheaper. Gender responsiveness, and also invest in policies such as education and health and credit to MSMEs, because probably because women, a lot of women compared to men, not necessarily absolutely, but compared to men, women have less access to schools and health facilities. And this also impacts on their capacity to access jobs. If we could address those health and education issues, we could also address how they benefit from debt-laden projects. And also introduce a mechanism for carbon tax or carbon swaps to mitigate the impacts of carbon emissions, but to be to be aware that the transition is inelastic and it comes with cost. It's not going to be cheap. So there are costs of transitioning from hydrocarbons to green energy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. I think that you raised a lot of issues. I mean, this direct connection between debt and the gender gap in the labor market through infrastructure projects, that's something that really that we need to explore, to do the same in different countries, because it's very direct impact. It's not just, some second round effect. No, it's just a direct impact. So, but I also think that it's important that you highlight, maybe it's the first time that we are discussing institutional capabilities in the government, institutional design, even credibility in the government, because we are talking about this policy design, and we need to make sure that we are running with capable governments and with credible governments as well, that can go for it. So I think that the issues of corruption and capabilities are as important as our analysis on public debt dynamics, So having said that, I'm going to move to our last case study from Ethiopia. Alemayehu Ugeda from Addis Ababa University. Are you there? The floor is yours.
Yes, I am. Thank you, Romy. Let me share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I should begin by thanking the IDRC for financing this research. and also Red Sur for managing this research. Thank you very much. We did it at Addis Ababa University, Institute of Development Policy Research, with my colleagues, Dr. Adisimer and Dr. Getinet Alamu. So we actually did 3 papers. This thing is not okay. We did 3 papers. One is about drivers of indebtedness in Ethiopia in the last 3 decades. What are the major drivers of indebtedness? And the second one is what is the impact, the growth and investment impact of debt. And the third one is a paper about the last point that Ramiro mentioned about the institutional aspect of debt management, including the institutional structure, corruption, laws, and this kind of stuff. So then we produced 3 papers. So I'll give you the general picture of debt in Ethiopia, and I've been advised by the organization to focus on the institutional aspect. Therefore, I'll tell you about the 2 papers, just the major findings. I will not go to the details of them. Now, Ethiopian debt significantly increased in the past 2 decades. We have about 60 billion. This is, by many countries' standard, it's not a big amount, but when you compare it to GDP, it is 53%. And in 2018, actually, it was 60%, so it's huge. More importantly, the debt servicing is becoming a major problem because the export sector in the last decade has been growing by about 3%, while the import and export gap is widening over time. So because of that, debt servicing, in particular the external debt servicing, which needs foreign exchange, is becoming a problem. As a result, even the government has suspended paying and asking lenders for restructuring. And I think a couple of weeks ago, the Chinese at least allowed the government an extension of 1 year, and it is negotiating with the multilateral finances. Because multilateral finances, IMF, in particular the World Bank IDA window, accounts for 50% of this debt, and bilateral dominated by Chinese, like 90% of bilateral is Chinese, which accounts for about 25% of the total debt, and private creditors about 20% here. Private creditors, bilaterals is 28%, of which 25% is Chinese, and 52% is pretty much World Bank and African Development Bank, with the ratio of 80-20%. So one of the issue that we picked was spending on the service debt has also become the highest spending category. Last year, it became 60% of the total spending. This is the combined sum of the spending on education and health, which is about 8%. So servicing is become the top spending item in the government budget. So the government has reached a point where it is heading towards suspending servicing its debt, waiting for creditors' goodwill for restructuring. Now, the fundamental causes, the first paper is very big, actually, about 60 pages, very exhaustive. We used historical data, we used econometric model, and basically to identify what are the major drivers. And as you can see, we call them fundamental and proximate drivers. The proximate drivers are, the immediate thing like liquidity problems, such as foreign exchange shortage, fiscal deficit. But the fundamental drivers are related to politics and governance, including geopolitics, because Ethiopia strategic location in the Red Sea area implies, the Russians, the West has been fighting over it in the past, and the Chinese and the US are trying to influence the process. So that determines the composition of debt. Whenever you shift to the other one, multilateral, bilateral dollars will come. Whenever you shift to the other, global power, other forms of shifts will come. I mean, a good illustration of this will be this graph here. As you can see here, this is the military regime which was in power between 1974 and 1991. The whole debt was pretty much military debt and owed to Russia. And then government, this was ousted by another regime called the TPLF, APRDF regime. Then this immediately accepted the structural adjustment program, and the debt profile completely changes now to the West and multilateral institutions. Then in 2005, there was an election, and following the election, the government was losing the election, therefore it became violent. So the West suspended its debt-creating flows. Then, as you can see here in this graph, immediately the government, that is 2005 is that election, the government shifted to domestic financing as well as to Chinese financing. So that kind of geopolitical and domestic political factors are another fundamental factors. On top of that, terms of trade deterioration, the structural trade deficit are also other fundamental factors. So we examined this in detail and came up to the conclusion that the major drivers of debt in Ethiopia are, number one is the trade deficit, the top, followed by terms of trade deterioration, the significant investment in saving gap because of poverty, like investment to GDP ratio is on the average 35 to 40% in 2 decades, while the saving rate is 5%. So that gap, which is related to development strategy, are found both historical analysis as well as using econometric model. We found that to be important. Now, the second paper is related to what is the impact of that debt, and we used growth model, and we use also an investment model to see the impact of that debt or debt creating flows on growth and investment. We found, interestingly, in the short-run effect, both on growth, per capita GDP growth, as well as investment to be positive, while the long-run effect in both cases to be negative because of primarily the debt burden and macroeconomic instability that the indebtedness or debt-financed growth has brought about. Now, with that major results, let me focus on the institutional aspect of the third paper. I'll elaborate it a little bit more, given the preference of the organizers. Now, what we found here is, interestingly, the Ministry of Finance is in charge of managing the debt, and it has an impressive organizational structure, including a particular department dealing with China's debt, but with limited knowledge on broader macro consequences of indebtedness, especially its implication on growth, repayment challenges, inflation. Lawmakers also at the parliament also have very limited knowledge about macroeconomic consequences of indebtedness, and they cannot raise those issues in the parliament, but they usually, when the executive proposes, they just approve it. This parliament we came up with the conclusion that parliament need to develop a system that calls independent expertise, both from the Ministry of Finance and from research and universities, so that whenever in debt certain loan is requested for approval, they listen to this expertise about its macroeconomic consequences, debt paying capacity, and what have you. That was the recommendation. So establishing that system of calling experts for testimony by Parliament, both for domestic and external loans, because domestic loans usually come in the context of financing the budget, which invariably becomes monetization of the deficit, with macroeconomic consequences, including inflation and depreciation that all mentioned. So therefore, we suggested that for that purpose. There are no adequate institutional constraints to the government accumulation of both external and domestic debt in practice. I mean, the government can borrow as much as it wants. So, following that failed election as the previous government, there was a limit before, but that government abandoned that limit and issued a new regulation, which literally allowed him to borrow as a wish. So reintroducing that limit to government debt borrowing from the central bank is worth considering. This policy needs to be augmented by monitoring of other macro indicators such as exports and import growth, because we found that as a fundamental cause of indebtedness. Setting up a legally binding ratios like debt service to GDP would be probably important. A significant institutional challenge of handling debt relates to incorporating the future challenge of debt in the planning and budgeting process to begin with. So when they do the planning, as I told you, they have quite sophisticated institutional structure, but the issue of debt is not incorporated when growth forecasts are made, when budgets are made, and the 5-year planning is made. So including those debt sustainability issues and potential macroeconomic implications in that process will be important. For that, capacity building in forecasting and using analytical tools is important. A lot of the recent debt problem in Africa is related to rosy growth forecasters, which assumed the debt carrying capacity of countries. But when those growths are frustrated by themselves as well as by external shocks such as COVID, Ukraine, Russia war, then the debt become a major problem. So analytical capacity on that will be very important to build. The economic growth that was brought in Ethiopia by debt was and is still cannot generate enough foreign exchange to service the debt, akin to the transfer problem that Germany had after World War II. So developing a technical tool for prioritization of spending category also important, because spending is ballooning in Ethiopia. So spending categories, prioritizing that is important. Technical tool for that important. At the budgets, at the various budgeting units, capacity building on project appraisal and monitoring is very important. That is missing. And finally, develop an exit strategy from persistent aid dependency, which is the major source of the debt-creating flows for financing growth. So growth is pretty much financed by this, as Paul also said, but we need to think what would be the exit strategy. This can be done by prudently managing its resources. This relates to corruption, controlling corruptions, and strengthening the legal transparency of public spending in the short run, and adequately covering your spending by your own means in the long run. And I should add one thing: we presented this we prepared 3 policy briefs, and we are lucky that the Ministry of Finance allow us to present this policy implications and our studies we are happy that the minister was present the whole 1.5 hours, and they took positively most of our recommendation, and they actually suggested to us that we need to work together to realize some of the policy recommendation that you made was the promise of the Ministry of Finance. That is what I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alemashehu. I think that you opened the black box of institutional design, behind debt management. So I think that there's a lot of food for thought on your presentation. So now we will hear comments from Arjan Tejan, Senior Program Specialist from IDRC. Arjan, are you there? Yes, we cannot hear you yet. No, you are mute, I think. No.
This is all because of my reputation that I talk too much. So it took some time to. The host was clearly stopping me from that. First of all, thank you, Ramiro, thank you, Red Sur, thank you everybody for a fantastic presentation. I was, apart from being slow to unmute myself, also vigorously writing, and it's really hard to comment on such a richness of papers. And I think Martin is coming after me, and hopefully, and I'm sure he'll have more substance. So I won't go into the substance of the recommendation, but just to say two things here. And they're not even questions. That one, we started off with this idea of, there was this 2-3 years ago, everybody saw this rising debt, and there was a global debate that developed very rapidly, and in that. And those debates are really important, and the calls for debt relief are really important and need to be continued and need to be informed by this work. And that's I think we'll talk about next steps, something that's really, really important. You've referred to Ramiro. So what you see coming out here is an enormous richness, variety, perhaps too much of a variety to synthesize it, right? But that's not a critique. That's the result of when institutions like IDRC that worked on this for 20 years came to this debate and came up with this incredible richness of things to analyze. Is this the last and final analysis? Paul, I hope you'll forgive me for saying no. It is like the beginning of this, right? It is, and that comes out so strongly from the Latin American papers. Even if debt is, we can debate how serious it is, even if debt is not that serious, the context in which makes talking about debt and how to manage that absolutely critical. Not because debt in itself is important. Great points about it can be good. Sometimes it's not good. The point is about how that is managed. So the diversity that we see here through these fantastic papers are just to congratulate everybody on that work, and really the important thing really is to publish the results, right? And we'll come back to that. Professor Alamayo already had some ideas about how this can be published, and it's absolutely important to document very clearly to a broad audience what came out of this exercise when you put a global challenge, a global question to specific contexts and people that are based in the policy spheres, like Adamayo spoke to and Paul spoke to, and I think CSEA, of course, also is very much the result of this is just fabulous. EPRC, I think, always had that, was very closely to policymakers. What Ma said about the two recommendations now really being considered by policymakers, I think is fantastic, and just an encouragement of so very much, and what Alamayo said about the how he and it'd be lovely we would love to hear much more about it, how that came about, right? Is the focus on the institutional capacity. It was not by chance, because correct me if I'm wrong, and the story that you tell is once you presented this result, policymakers realized that this is really important. Nobody wants to talk about debt, right? But this is really important to do, and that you quite simply need institutional capacity to do that. So the diversity and how that engages with the realities in those different places. Yes, it brings the diversity, very hard to bring together, but absolutely the right thing to do. So the only question, so we need to document that very, very clearly, and you've done a fantastic, everybody's done a fantastic job doing this this far. And I think it's really important to follow that up by continuing work on the specific policy instrument, right? I mean, take the ones in Nigeria, carbon tax and debt for climate swaps. Like, 3 years ago, it's like, without, was it at all on the agenda, right? So it needs to be furthered, needs to be seen from the diversity perspective, like it needs to integrate the gender and equity analysis in that climate transition. So very much a call for further work, and I think it's also really worth thinking about and again documented very clearly how this research connected to policy making, right? This of course, where high quality academic analysis, but the way that you engage with policymakers, how you included them in those discussion, broad results, maybe that reshape what you did, you change your plan as a result. That in itself also, I think, is very much worth considering. And we don't have time because we already spent 2.5 hours, but I for sure would love to hear more about how that works and how that leads to further prioritization of work. So thanks so much, Ramiro, for thanks, Cecilia, thanks everybody. This was a fantastic research project and was so well presented. Thank you.
Thank you, Arian, for that. I think that we need to work on what you just mentioned, and also trying to do more about these peer learning, activities that we are engaging in here, crossing information, ideas, innovative solutions. I think that that's really important for the next steps. So I will try to come up with the final comment from Martin Kessler, Executive Director from the FDL. First, just Martin, let me summarize some of our key takeaways, and then you can react to that just for closing, the whole webinar. So I have 5 takeaways, very quick. First, we are talking about lower middle income and upper middle income countries that are going to experience a lot of problems and issues around that. So I think that we need to rethink, access to these facilities from international institutions, because we are not talking about low-income countries. In some cases, yes, but the problem is why, across middle-income countries as well. First. Second, I think that we need to work harder on defining sustainability, along the lines of Fernando and Luis Miguel's research program. It's not only about short-term fiscal, stance. Maybe it's more about, incorporating the environment and inclusion into this framework for assessing sustainability. So we need to work harder on that, on methodologies, scalability of some pilots in some countries and institutions, and so on. Third, I think that we need to see how international financial institutions can help in supporting innovative solutions. For example, this Nigerian case of debt for nature, but also debt for care, for example, something that we need to explore here in Latin America. So then I think that we need to also work together with financial institutions to align goals, these short-term goals for the global economy, such as the environment, with short-term goals in debtor countries. So analyzing this discussion that we had on consumption taxes or on fiscal rents in Bolivia, or for production incentives and many other aspects, they all need to be connected, in aligning, these actors in bringing, public debt sustainability, environmental sustainability, and social sustainability. And finally, regarding next steps and going to Arian's comments, I think that we need to document this, we need to find a place for each one of our lessons into a framework. But again, I think that next step is trying to have toolkits and policy frameworks, and with that, starting a conversation with governments. I mean, not only adding new emerging topics to public debt sustainability discussions, but to come up with a proper framework, that we can use in different countries. I think that that's for us next steps. So having said that, Martin, if you want to just comment on this discussion, the international arena, and your own research on that, the floor is yours. Okay.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Amero, and thanks to all for the fascinating studies. And I think, just not to be too long, because I think a lot of things need to be integrated, but I think what from the point of view of the Finance for Development Lab, I think we've been working on issues at the global level and asking very similar questions. And I think we come to similar conclusions, and I think want to reinforce the message that we have all the diagnostics that look at both the short-term constraints linked to the interest payments, linked to the public debt, and also longer-term sustainability, both in terms of financial debt sustainability and the more the environmental sustainability questions. And I think those, this set of studies really shows a few key themes. I think the first one is that of the need for, I would say, some kind of opportunistic or at least pragmatic approach to debt consideration. I think the example of the swaps is a very good one. When there's a pressure of liquidity, when short-term interest payments are too high, the tools of swap is really important. It's not, it doesn't solve everything. It tends to push back commitments to a longer term, but when the debt service today is high, when there's a liquidity problem rather than a solvency problem, it can serve both the objectives of environmental nature or social objectives, and an objective of lowering the weight of debt service payments. Now, why do policymakers, both domestic and international, need to be opportunistic? Because this tool requires a lot of different things to come together and to right political environment. When you had swaps mostly in Latin America, and for now, there was one in Gabon recently, but it requires someone who is willing to finance a new debt, and someone who is willing to guarantee the new loan, so that the new loan is cheaper than the old loan, and so that's how they tend to work. And so this kind of right now there's a moment where there's a lot of interest in swaps, and so I think it's why it's important that those kind of diagnostics are made at the country level and are passed on to policymakers. And I think they need to be discussed both in the case of Nigeria, in Nigeria, but also these actors that have say they were interested. The European Investment Bank, as public stated, they wanted to get into this deals. The US DFC has been very active. So a need for opportunism to use the moment and those diagnostics. The second one is the second point I want to make is I think the increase in uncertainty, and I think that a lot of studies have shown that how much the inherent uncertainty of climate change. That I won't come back to that, but also of the global environment. I think a lot of studies, and I think they can dig more into what it means for the tools, the diagnostic tools that we have, really show how much external uncertainty there is. So some countries, foresee a decrease in their exports in natural resources. Some others expect an increase in natural resources in the coming 2-3 years. The horizon is not always clear, and these kind of uncertainties are important. To that, you will add on, new possible taxes from developed economies. You have the carbon border adjustment mechanism of the EU, which will put more costs in the emissions of developing countries. So this environment really requires new diagnostics. I think one in particular will be around what we call debt sustainability. The IMF and the World Bank are revising their tool to assess that sustainability, and it's an important moment to ask about how do we integrate questions about climate, how do we integrate questions about the pressures of liquidity, and also the ability of concessional finance. Probably in the future, concessional finance will be less available. You will have larger MDBs, maybe, if the reforms that are in the pipelines are activated. But for now, we're discussing much less, the IDA, the concessional flows of mutual finance, and much more the more expensive, more addressed to middle-income countries like the IDRC. And so taking that into account is important in country strategies. I think I will. I can end there so that we not go for too long.
Okay, thank you, Martin, for this. I think that I mean, you provide some, examples of, ways of trying to spread all these lessons and knowledge and find opportunities, that are out there. So thank you for your comments. And well, thanks everyone for taking this time. I think that we learned a lot. At least I learned a lot, I can say that. Thank you, IDRC, thank you, Red Sur, and thanks all our colleagues from Africa, Latin America, and Paris. I thank you, Martin. So, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, everybody.